And then, check, check, check. I suddenly realized that I was burned out. I'd like to ask you a question. What do we need to not just survive, but to thrive in these stressful and uncertain times? I'm Michael Kearney, and I'm going to talk about deep resilience, what it is, why it matters, and how we can make it part of our lives. I'm also going to talk about self-care and how self-care is as basic a need as sleeping or eating or drinking water. But for us sentient beings living in a world of so much stress, self-care as we usually think about it is often not enough. We need something more. We need deep resilience. I'm going to share with you some of the lessons I've learned about deep resilience from my work as a palliative care doctor over the past 44 years, working with people who are living with serious illness and with all the stress and uncertainty and loss and sometimes pain that goes with this. My patients have been my teachers. Back in 2008, I was working with a group of others on a paper for JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, on burnout in physicians working at the end of life. At that time, I'd already been working as a palliative care doctor for 24 years. And while I was interested in the topic of burnout, I wouldn't have really considered that I was burned out. Sure, I felt tired sometimes. Sometimes I found myself fantasizing about leaving medicine to do other things I was interested in. And my work didn't have the same zest and bounce to it as it had earlier in my life. But I put this down to getting older. I didn't think of it as burnout. It was the night before sending in the final version of the article, and I was sitting there reading it through when I came one more time to the symptoms of burnout. Overwhelming exhaustion, physical and emotional. That kind of exhaustion that we don't just bounce back from after a good night's sleep or a weekend off or even a vacation. Depersonalization, a sense of detachment, even dissociation from oneself, from others, in one's workplace. And a sense of a lack of personal accomplishment. Never quite achieving the quality in one's work that one would like to. And then, check, check, check. I suddenly realized that I was burned out. But why? How? In the research I'd done for the article, I'd learned a lot about burnout. How to recognize it, how to prevent it. I'd learned that there are 3 common occupational stress syndromes. The first of these is burnout itself. And I'd learned that the genesis of burnout, the most common cause of burnout, are the stresses that arise between us as individuals and bureaucracy. For example, Dr. C, an oncologist whose story we follow in the article, talked about how it wasn't losing her patients that was the greatest cause of her burnout. It was fighting with insurance companies. It's that kind of bureaucratic stress that leads to burnout. The second occupational stress syndrome is called compassion fatigue, and it's also known as vicarious traumatization or secondary traumatic stress. Compassion fatigue arises from the stresses generated between us as individuals and another who is suffering. So we're present to someone in pain, we're present to somebody who's been traumatized, and we are secondarily traumatized by that experience. The third is moral distress syndrome. And moral distress arises when we're in a situation where we have an inner sense of what the right thing is, what feels right in the situation we're in, and yet we're prevented from acting on that by external constraints. I learned that burnout is the common endpoint of all these three occupational stress syndromes. So in our article, we offered a model of self-care which we called self-awareness-based self-care. We endorse the value of traditional self-care, or the sort of self-care that we usually practice by default. We might call this self-care 1.0, a combination of having boundaries, personal and professional, that protect us in stressful situations, combined with activities outside the workplace that we know help us to rest, relax, restore. That's traditional self-care. And we proposed that these strategies are likely to be more effective if combined with self-knowledge and mindfulness. This is self-awareness-based self-care, what we might call self-care 1.5. And yet, despite practicing what we were preaching in our article, I was burned out. I felt disappointed and puzzled and a little confused. How? Why was this happening? Clearly, all the self-care I'd been practicing hadn't been enough to prevent me from burning out. I thought about this long and hard, and I realized that the most likely cause of my burnout was vicarious traumatization, that I'd been exposed for many years to the suffering that others were experiencing, their grief, their loss, their pain, and how this had gone in under the radar as sort of micro traumas, multiple micro traumas over a long time, and that had taken its toll. And then it occurred to me that we're all vulnerable to these stresses that can lead to burnout. Maybe you could just think for a moment in your situation, in your workplace. Do you struggle with bureaucracy at times? Can you relate to Dr. C fighting with insurance companies? That kind of bureaucratic hassle. Do you have a colleague who's living with the diagnosis of a serious illness, or who's just had a loss in their life or in their family that you're close to? Or in your own personal life situation, are you caring for somebody with a chronic illness, or have you experienced personal loss? Or just zooming back and looking at the big picture, just thinking for a moment of the world that we're all living in, looking at all the turmoil and all the change that's happening politically and socially, all the uncertainty, thinking about our young people growing up in this world with such an uncertain future. We're all exposed to so much stress on a daily basis. When we look at these situations, when we look at our world in pain, on fire, we feel there's something so wrong. We feel there's something we'd really like to make better, and yet we're not able to act in a way that can make, at least in the immediate term, a difference. It's not surprising that there's a global pandemic of burnout. A recent large international study found that 70% of people of all ages are burned out, and 87% of Gen Z reported feelings of burnout in the previous year. While Self-Care 1.0 and Self-Care 1.5 do offer some protection, they're simply not enough. We need something more. We need Self-Care 2.0. But what might Self-Care 2.0 look like? That's a question I carried around with me for a long time. The question became a spiritual quest that led me to one day standing at the edge of a creek, looking into a pool. And as I looked down into the pool, something caught my eye. It was circular. It was made of twigs. It was a bird's nest in the stream, with the water flowing ever so gently through it. And as I stood there, looking at the nest in the stream, words came. The loose and open weave of the heart. The loose and open weave of the heart. In the weeks and months that followed, I realized that what I'd been gifted here was the outline of another possible way of being with pain. I understood that Self-Care 1.5 is like a shield that we can use to protect ourselves from the stresses that life may bring towards us. This is important, this is necessary, and there are times when we need a good shield. But for chronic, relentless, overwhelming pain, this is simply not enough. We need something else, something more. A new understanding, a new perspective, a new approach. The nest in the stream was pointing out what this might look like. I remembered that the nest was in the stream. It was being held in something bigger, something more than itself. And I remembered how the water ever so gently was flowing in at one side, through the bowl of the nest and out at the other side. It began to dawn on me that what I was being shown here was that I didn't need to be so afraid of my pain, that maybe I too could let it flow through me, knowing that I am held in something more, something bigger, something deeper. And then, as I began to practice this on a day-to-day basis with people in pain, I began to notice that, surprisingly, it brought me into a sense of deeper connection. And that rather than feeling burdensome or heavy, it actually felt lighter, as though a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. It wasn't any longer just up to me. It wasn't just up to me to hold this on my own. We, me and the other, were somehow in this together. And then I understood something very important, that in suffering our suffering together, we come into the mystery of healing. And then, not long after this, I found myself in a redwood forest in Big Sur, standing there in the greenness of the undergrowth, looking up into the canopy with the morning mist coming in from the ocean, in that incredible silence that one feels in the presence of the redwoods. When I went back a few months later in December 2020, this is what I found. A wildfire had swept through the area. Ashes, broken branches, dead trees. I came across this great redwood, its trunk broken midway, its body strewn on the ground, blackened, charcoaled. I took it for dead. But then, when I had an opportunity to visit again, a year or so later, I went to visit that redwood, and this is what I found. It had not only survived, it was thriving. It had become a forest with green shoots bursting from its trunk and up from its root bed. How was this possible? Because its roots, its rootedness in the earth, in the mycorrhizal network, in the web of life, had not been harmed by the fire. The redwood taught me that being rooted in something deeper and more enduring than our surface selves brings deep resilience. So this then is what deep resilience looks like. A nest in the stream, a deeply rooted redwood. This is what self-care 2.0 looks like. From the nest in the stream, I learned that to survive the tsunami of suffering, I need to let it flow through me. From the redwood, I've learned that to thrive, I need to remember that I too am rooted in something deeper, something that isn't afraid and that doesn't die. I'd like to share a quote from the Dalai Lama. A tree with strong roots can survive the most violent storm, but the tree can't grow roots just as the storm appears on the horizon. It's the capacity that we all have within us. It's not just a burden, something else to add to our enormous to-do list. It's about noticing what brings us into our heart's estate, into a felt sense of deep connectedness with ourselves, with others, with our world. For me personally, what roots me deeply is my meditation practice and time I spend in nature, in the natural world. I'm happy and grateful to report that I'm now more engaged than ever in working to relieve suffering and bring healing to others, that I'm no longer burned out. So I ask you, what brings you into your heart's estate? What brings you into a sense, into a felt sense of deep connection with yourself, with others, with our world? Please think about this. And then act on this. Make it part of your life. Self-care 1.0 and self-care 1.5 are essential and important. And you need to make that part of your life too. But it's not enough for the long haul. You also need to think about how to make self-care 2.0 part of your life. And then, like a nest in the stream or like a great redwood rooted in the earth, simply rest back into whatever it is brings you into this deep sense of rootedness, this deep sense of connection, and allow yourself to be held. And rest back into that, like a little child in your grandmother's arms.